Hello, my name is Joe van Wyk and welcome to my channel. You're watching Screenplay Essentials and this is Series 2. Series 2 has to do with understanding character, and I've made it my super objective to try to at least pump out 20 episodes that deals with character. And I invite you, if you're a young filmmaker or a young film student or a young screenwriter, to join me on this journey as I go into all these type of basic understandings of what characters are and who the characters are and what makes them tick. I'll go into the primary characters, the main characters, the secondary characters, the tertiary characters when we write the world, the setting for our stories or our characters that they inhabit in, and also the multiple archetypes that we find, the Carl Jung's archetypes, the mentors, the heroes, the anti-heroes, the tricksters, the temptress, the hardball detective even, all those great things that I'd like to explore with you. And this first episode has to do with the main character that is separated from the protagonist. And in the second part, I'll be talking about the protagonist. And it's of my utmost pleasure to go with you through this masterclass type of scenarios where we break down what is character and understand character. So before we get into the separation of things, let me just quickly do a basic understanding of what a main character is, or the classical definition of a main character. This is essentially a primary character, often played by the lead actor, that serves as the anchor of the story. It's a central figure in the story in which they are the eyes and the ears and the heart of the audience, in which they experience the plot and the story unfolding, and they root for them or they despise them or whatever the case might be. But this main character is one that often receives most of the screen time. In fact, if you write your script, your short film or your feature film, it's advised that at least 60 to 70% of the chunk of scenes that you're writing has to do with your main character. And if the character is not present in the scene, it's either have to do with who generates the conflict, whether it's a world situation conflict or driven by an antagonist or a villain, or thematic devices that help support your main character. But essentially what you're trying to do is that a main character is often what the story is about, who the story is about, and in some cases, or exception to the rule, is that they act as the eyes of the audience observing someone else's story. Now, in storytelling, there's a very important aspect or component that you need to understand as a young filmmaker, young writer, is the perspective in which we tell stories. You either get an objective point of view or a subjective point of view. And you get the first person point of view, which is found in novels, in how it's written to the reader. But in screenplays and in cinema, we deal with objective writing and subjective writing. Now, objective writing is a view from the outside. It's the distance between the audience and the characters. If you think about the old movies from the studio system, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, they often were done in an objective fashion. And it comes from that ideology of theater plays where the audience sits in the auditorium and they're watching a play on the stage. They are removed from the action, but they are viewing the story in an objective fashion. You also get cinematography language that convey that objectivity in the shot attitudes, whether it's wide shot, long shots, medium two shots. Those type of things often convey an objective point of view. The iconic Casablanca is a beautiful example of objective writing. There's no clear protagonist in the story. It's basically the one character helping another character trying to get out of Casablanca. Now, often is the case that trilogies are done in an objective writing fashion. If you think about the Star Wars trilogy, the Godfather trilogy, the Planet of the Apes trilogy, and even Lord of the Rings, all written objectively. Now, subjective point of view is putting the audience as closely as possible to your main character. They are seeing what the main character sees, they feel what the main character feels, and especially when you deal with empathy, that subjectivity is of utmost importance with your audience. Films like 1917 and Birdman beautifully shows that point of view of the main characters, and often supported by the cinematography in their long shots. Frances McDormand's character in Nomadland shows this beautiful subjective main character that experiencing grief, but also a survival by herself and her adaptability in a community. You also get that language in subjectivity where it's over the shoulder, or someone's looking at a phone and you see the close-up of the phone. Someone's looking at the distance and then reacting to what they're seeing. All that has to do with the language of subjectivity in conveying that type of storytelling. It's very important as a writer to understand these two things and determine what type of writer you are. From my film school years long ago, I've already decided that I'm a subjective perspective storyteller, whereas others completely write objective. I can immediately see someone is writing objectivity in how they deal with their main characters and the plot and their scenes. They often have an objective perspective when dealing that, whereas I favor more the subjective approach to writing the main characters and dealing with the scenes. That objectivity or subjective way of storytelling is how you define yourself as a writer, and it's very important to understand that perspective going forward in anything that you do. For example, How the West Was Won, a very famous John Ford movie. In fact, all of John Ford movies were often done in an objective perspective. And even if you look at a modern example like The Avengers, the storytelling is told through an objective perspective. Compared to, for example, a Rear Window, in which you see the subjectivity of the main character and how the camera is focused on that main character, and the storytelling is about that main character that's observing a possible crime in a neighboring flat. In my own honest opinion, subjective point of views are the strongest because it's the most effective way of engaging your audience. If you think about that golden diamond, the fear, empathy, desire, likability, all those things are extremely important to hook your audience, and you can do it successfully through a subjective point of view. You can also get a combination of these two, like for example the film 2001 Space Odyssey. It starts off as an objective film writing, but then becomes subjective, especially with the conscience of hell and the experiences of the main character, and then almost in a sense ends in an objective manner as well. But the ideology of 2001 switches between these perspectives from objective writing into subjective writing. There are thousands of masterpieces that are done objectively and subjectively, but I've just highlighted a few. It's just a matter of knowing the principles to look out for so that you can easily spot the difference. Now you might ask, why do you want to separate the main character from the protagonist? Usually when you have a protagonist, the protagonist is the main character themselves, but the idea of that separation has to do with how you can build up or mythologize your protagonist. Let me just quickly paint you an example. We all know the hero figure Hercules, and generally what you would do is you would create a hero protagonist and you put the audience in the feet of that character and you go onto that journey. But let's say, for example, an academic scholar decides to follow Hercules on his journey to record his triumphs or trials. And what happens with that type of story is that we, the audience, it's almost like a semi-subjective story where we see the story through the academic scholar. The actions of Hercules would have an impact on the main character. Now, maybe it's well known that Hercules is a very kind and heroic figure, but in this specific type of story, through the eyes of the main character, he notices that Hercules is a coward, or Hercules acts out in a very irrational fashion, like while defeating the Hydra, he's putting other people's lives in danger, for example. It can also help disguise the true motivations of a protagonist to help with the mystery of the story and how you can circumvent the expectations of the audience through using a main character in which you focus the story on, but then actually reveals, oh, the story is actually about the protagonist, but we didn't know because the screen time and the camera focused on the main character observing the story of the protagonist. It's a different perspective of how to tell that story. Generally, a stronger point of view is very remarkable and very desirable for the audience to follow when you put the main character as the protagonist. But when the main character is separated from the protagonist, it can tell a different story. And often what happens in these type of cases is that Usually the main character is fulfilled. They can be a flat character or they can be a round character with flaws, but the main character may know the truth of the situation, the truth of the story that gets revealed through the actions of the protagonist, and vice versa. The main character can learn from the protagonist how the protagonist is changing or main character changing, and the protagonist is a flat character. Because of the actions of the flat character, the main character changes. So there's a couple of ways of how the character arc can be implemented in that separation between the main character and the protagonist. A good example is another Alfred Hitchcock movie, Marnie, in which the main character is in the title, the story is about her, but the protagonist in the story is the male figure who tries to help Marnie get over her traumatic psychosis or whatever that story was about, but there's a separation between Marnie and the protagonist. Isolating your main character from the protagonist can be a very difficult thing to do. It takes a bit of maturity in your writing experience to pull that off. But the key important thing is to ask yourself, why are you doing it? So the very nature of that campfire stories evolved into theater, where the audience is separated from the players, and that evolved into cinema. You can even include radio in there as well. That became subjective to the listener. But the ultimate evolution of that type of story became to a subjective point of view in which the main characters are portrayed, and even a tradition of how storybooks are written to have a central figure that is also talking about another character that the story is about. Now, there are generally 5 ways to separate the main character, or 5 techniques that can be found in that separation between main character and protagonist. The first one is what we call a false protagonist or a alternative point of view. This type of character is introduced with a lot of screen time as a central figure in the story, but then it's later revealed that they're not the protagonist and they are actually observing someone who is moving the plot forward. This type of main character can also be a coward, that they may not have the desire to move the plot forward, but would rather choose to follow and support the protagonist. In the case of Sam being a main character who supports Frodo, the protagonist, in the quest to destroy the ring. In other cases, they may not be involved in the central conflict at all. They may just act as a surrogate to the audience in how certain truths are revealed about the protagonist. In the film, Lives of Others very iconically shows a main character who's spying on a family, and the father figure is the protagonist of that family, and the main character sympathizes later on with the family and helps the father. Sicario is one of the examples where there's a lot of screen time and focus placed on an FBI agent that is tasked to stop a drug cartel. But it gets revealed later on that the story is actually about another person, another character that eventually takes revenge or the murder of his family. The famous Titanic is a story about Rose. She's the main character of that story. In fact, the story opens with her. It's a bookend opening. But Jack is the protagonist in that story in his pursuit to obtain what he desires. Saving Private Ryan, we know the main character needs to be saved, and the main character only shows up at the end of the movie, and the story is told through the protagonist taking the group of warriors or band of soldiers trying to accomplish their mission. In The Return of the Jedi, the main character is Luke, but Leia is surprisingly the protagonist who moves the plot forward in how she rescues Han. She leads the mission to Endor, helping the rebels in space to blow up the Death Star. Mad Max Fury Road, a beautiful example with Mad Max being the main character, but it's a Furiosa that is the protagonist in that story. Another surprise is Neo from The Matrix is the main character, but Morpheus is the protagonist. He's the one pursuing the prophecy, who's pushing the story forward the whole time, and Neo being the main character, ultimately resolving the central conflict with the machines. And lastly, the biopic genre often shows a main character as not a protagonist at all. They're often just a main character that are confined by the historical facts. It's a main character that goes through the plot points of the historical account that's being presented and showcased to the audience. The second point would be like an unrelatable protagonist, where you have a protagonist that has a personality or persona that is difficult to relate to from the audience point of view. So you create a main character that's almost like an entry point to the story, in which your audience can latch on to that main character, relate to them, and view the protagonist through their eyes. And sometimes you get a dramatic irony with the main character versus the protagonist, because the personalities can be completely in binary opposition. The original Willy Wonka, the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, was a main character protagonist, whereas Tim Burton's Willy Wonka with Johnny Depp is as a very unrelatable type of protagonist, and Charlie as the main character acts as the eyes for the audience. The same thing with Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Sherlock Holmes being a very unique detective, erratic type of personality, whereas Watson is a very normal main character in which the audience can identify with. The Great Gatsby shows a flawed and dishonest protagonist seen more clearly through the eyes of the main character, Nick. Then the third one is very famously the multi-main character scenarios, that a film has multiple main characters but none of them are the protagonist. These multiple main group type of films often is done through an objective perspective storytelling. Iconic movie 12 Angry Men is about a group of jurymen that has to decide the fate of a court case, and no one there in that story is the protagonist. And if you think about the movie Carnage, that tells a story about two married couples who comes to a point to resolve the conflict between the two children that were fighting in the schoolyard. Both parents have their own unique perspectives on the conflict and their own child, as well as their own inner conflicts between themselves, and it all spirals out of control in their interaction with one another, trying to resolve the conflict between the two children. Quentin Tarantino's filmography is a great example of this sort of thing. The Hateful Eight, there's no protagonist in the Hateful Eight. It's a bunch of Hateful Eight main characters in the story trapped in a situation. The very iconic Reservoir Dogs, very mysterious group of main characters that identities are kept a secret, and they resolve the conflict when things go south. Very iconic Pulp Fiction tells the story of a group of main characters. Neither one is a protagonist, but they're all dealing with in the conflict that they find themselves in. Even in the film Inglourious Basterds, you would think the bastards are the protagonist, but they are actually the main characters. And the female character in that story that goes out to kill a certain figure, she is the protagonist in that story. In contrast, for example, Kill Bill and Django Unchained shows a main character that is a protagonist. And the same thing with Guy Ritchie's films, the Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch, also a group of multiple main characters with no clear protagonist, and these main characters are all telling their own stories within a larger picture or larger scope of story. Requiem for a Dream features a group of main characters whose interconnected stories are shared in their descent into addiction from the core of the narrative. While each character's journey is distinct, they all share a common experience with addiction and its destructive impact on their lives. Wes Anderson's French Dispatch primarily features a group of main characters who, rather than a single protagonist, with each character's story contributing to the overall narrative. The iconic Breakfast Club focuses on 5 teenagers from different social groups who find themselves in detention together. The fourth one would be subtext and social commentary. This is a clever way to, when you're separating the main character from the protagonist, is a way to highlight social norms or social behaviors, political themes, universal themes that everyone can understand, motifs and symbolisms that can be highlighted in the nature of humanity, and you can expose that by telling that specific perspective through the eyes of the main character, separated from the protagonist. A good example is the iconic To Kill a Mockingbird that tells the story through the eyes of Scout, the main character, but the lawyer is the protagonist in the story, and they deal with that moral dilemma of that court case. Beauty and the Beast that highlights that the beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that's not too quick to judge appearances. That shows that the main character is the beast, but Belle, she is the protagonist of that story. The two characters in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood beautifully shows the subtext of working actors with stuntmen, and coincidentally it highlights the importance of stuntmen with actors, and Rick being the main character of the story. Cliff is clearly the protagonist throughout the story and also resolves the conflict at the end of the movie. Tropic Thunder is a beautiful example of the social commentary of actors having to go through some sort of boot camp in order to star in a war picture. It's a humorous satire on actors that all think they are on a movie set, but they're actually in real life on a very dangerous, in a very hostile environment. The film Crash also demonstrates a group of interconnected characters, each with their own story and motivations. The film explores how these intersecting lives with one another highlights themes of race, prejudice, and social issues. There's no single character whose journey drives the narrative of the story, but instead the film focuses on the collective experiences of these characters. The iconic Doctor Strangelove shows the film with multiple key characters rather than a single protagonist. While Doctor Strangelove is featured prominently in the title, the film is more a character study of various individuals, highlighting the potential of miscommunication and the destructive nature of a nuclear war. Then lastly, the unique narrator. This is a narrator that is not part of the main characters of the story. It's a narrator who tells the story for the audience, and they're often the main character of that film that story is about, talking about other main characters or other protagonists. This voice of God, narrator voice, is an omnipresent, omnipotent character that's often responsible for exposition in a film, and it also opens films like the famous Casablanca again, or the famous A Matter of Life and Death, Stairway to Heaven. Unseen narrator that acts as a central main figure that helps the audience in a sense. A very old movie, It's a Wonderful World, shows a narrator, an angel talking to God, trying to get his wings back, and by doing so to help the protagonist of the story, and even gives the protagonist a second chance at life. And the TV series Arrested Development is another beautiful example of a narrator who takes it upon himself to narrate the story, and often is the case where he highlights that he is the main character or the true main character of that story, despite what the other characters may think. So in conclusion, I hope this all makes sense. I hope you get the picture that you can separate the main character from your protagonist, and there are various ways of doing that, and hopefully the examples that I've given you is a good idea of what you can do. Just note that about the subjectivity and objectivity, because there are writers who love objective writing, and they would solely focus on creating main characters that are not protagonists at all, or separate the main character from the protagonist. And then there are subjective writers who solely focus on creating a main character that is the protagonist. The important thing is that you need to take the time to ask yourself a question regarding the central conflict or the central problem of the story and who it affects to. Is the main character important or the protagonist important? Who has the ability to change or to grow or to change? Is it the main character or the protagonist? And essentially, what is the story? What is the story about, and who is the story about? Is it about the main character or the protagonist? These questions you need to ask, especially when you're separating these two. At least you can see that not every writer writes a protagonist. Not every writer writes main characters that are not protagonists. So just be fully aware that you get these things, and hopefully this helps you and not confuse you. Whatever unique story you're writing, unique premise that you're dealing with, and the unique characters that you've designed, whether my character is a protagonist that is pushing the story forward, or whether I'm creating a main character that is not a protagonist And you should always ask yourself why that is. Hopefully you can then write compelling stories by fully understanding that you get main characters that are not protagonists. Join me for the next part where I'll go into the fundamental components of writing a great protagonist. Thank you for watching, and join me on this journey as I go through 20 episodes, hopefully 20 episodes, delving into a character and understanding the basics of character. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in part 2.